Hello, my name is Mabel, and welcome to the podcast/interview section of You and Voting, where I dive deep into political participation with people who are actively engaged. Today, I met with Robert Austin, the social studies specialist at the Utah State Board of Education, to discuss the importance of education, how social studies enriches a community, and how we can support educators. Okay, thank you so much, Robert, for joining me for this interview for my Girl Scout capstone project. In a few sentences, could you please give me an introduction about yourself? What do you like to do? What's a general overview of yourself and your career?
So my name is Robert Austin. So it's Robert, A-U-S-T-I-N. So my name is Robert Austin, and I was a school teacher for 10 years before coming to the state in my role as a social studies specialist. So because of that, I have a great affection for history and a great affection for old stuff and artifacts and the stories of people. So those are some of the things that I care about. And then I also care about this incredible state we live in. So I'm really enjoy getting out into these mountains, and went up walking through Red Butte Garden yesterday, just to enjoy some of nature before our winter hits us again.
Yeah. Are there any challenges teaching modern social studies?
Well, I think for social studies teachers, and even when I was teaching Utah studies, and this has been a while, I think the biggest thing that is a challenge is helping students see how relevant the topics are. People understand that they need to be able to read and write. So, of course, in language arts, they're going to be learning about characters and engaging in the study of literature, learning how to read and write and speak and listen. But, the social studies concepts that we want students to understand, whether those be history or geography or economics or political science or psychology, all of those topics are so connected to the lives of all of us, mm-hmm. that the first big challenge, I think, for teachers is to help students really understand that and help connect the conversations people were having 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 300 years ago, really, in many ways, aren't that different than the kinds of conversations we need to be having today. Mm-hmm. And I think one of those, for example, the idea of being able to compromise, the idea of being able to kind of navigate through some really hard issues together, is a skill that we've got to continue to foster and encourage and develop in young people, because that kind of spirit of compromise was at the heart of the development of the Constitution, for example, mm-hmm. which was never perfect. And, within the very language of the Constitution, in the preamble, it talks about creating a more perfect union. We're trying to get to some place where we can learn how to live together. And I think that that's one of the really cool fundamental questions that I talk about with educators, is to say that in a lot of social studies education, it's helping us answer that really fundamental question of how shall we live together? How do we, in this country and in this world, but definitely in this country that is predicated on this concept of e pluribus unum, that out of many, many fantastic backgrounds and ways of looking at the world and ways of knowing, how do we then create one country that really focuses on the common good and thinks about how do we live together? And so those are really big questions. Mm-hmm. And then in a social studies class, you've got to be able to help students kind of navigate and think about the answers to those questions. Yeah. And, it's a lot easier in some ways to teach and have students memorize, the date of this battle or the individual story of a certain person in history, but it's more important to also then take that information and weave it into helping students kind of navigate and think about that question. How is it that we're going to figure out how to live together?
Yeah. I think that's a perfect way to segue into my next question. Social studies can be really engaging with cultural awareness and civic engagement, but they can also be really controversial. How do educators approach topics while maintaining free thinking in students?
Yeah, it's a really interesting time that we're living in, actually. We have a lot of impulses in this country to kind of clamp down on conversations in the classroom. Mm-hmm. And really at a moment when we need to be developing those skills among students even more so, we have some teachers who become nervous about that.
Yeah.
And so what I talk about with teachers is, we're all in this together. So you create a culture in your classroom of learning. You create a culture in your classroom of trust. You create a culture in your classroom where the teacher is not the only person with all of the information, that it's all of us together building a community of learners. And that includes then parents. It includes other stakeholders who can see that in a classroom where you're going to ask a question about, for example, in Utah, what are we going to do about water? How do we protect the Great Salt Lake? Even a question that on the surface seems rather benign is fraught with controversy. Yeah. Because you've got multiple stakeholders thinking about water, and there are going to be some winners and some losers economically, for example, when it comes to water. And a lot of issues really do focus on money and power, and having those conversations with students and helping students kind of think about the multiple perspectives that are at the heart of some of the really core issues that we're trying to address in the world. That's a really, really important skill set to develop. So for educators, what we recommend are, first of all, sticking to the academic standards. And those aren't, I don't think, that doesn't limit your work. Yeah. But it really helps you, first of all, think about what's the academic outcome? What's the reason why you want to engage in whatever kinds of conversations you need to have, number one. So tied to the standards. Then are the conversations you're going to be having or the discussions you're having, are they developmentally appropriate? There are some topics of conversation that are appropriate when you're a senior in high school that are not as they're just not going to be as academically rigorous and as really fruitful when you're in fifth grade. There's just you can do that. And then how do you make sure that you engage parents and guardians in making sure that you're as transparent as possible about the kinds of things you're talking about? If I were teaching 7th grade Utah studies and I knew that we were going to be talking about water and sustainable development in the state, I might make sure that I sent a bunch of questions home to the parents to say, hey, we're going to be talking about this. I'd love it if you would engage your students in some of these conversations and think about this, while you're driving to school or texting them or maybe having dinner, heaven forbid you should actually sit down and talk with each other. So you've got multiple frameworks. You've got standards that are developmentally appropriate, that are transparent with stakeholders. And then the final piece is really helping make sure that in a classroom that you've developed the skills about conversation. You've helped students kind of structure their conversations in a way that moves away from kind of debate, which is what we see all the time. We see winners and losers all the time. On every message is all about people shouting over each other, and that we move towards some kind of sense of dialogue. Mm-hmm. What are the kinds of ways we can develop some real conversations and dialogue where your mind might actually be changed or not, and that's okay. But at least you've listened to one another and engaged in that process.
I think that's a great answer for that. You kind of touched about this a little bit, but how can parents and other leaders support what students are learning in class? You said like talking to them. Are there any other ways?
Yeah, I think we have an understandable impulse to try to protect young people, right? It makes perfect sense. And so what that can manifest itself in is kind of coddling. And what I mean by that is we can't really afford in this country to have students who don't have the skills to think their way out of a paper bag. Mm-hmm. We have to help kids think about hard topics, complicated topics, whether it's, I would just name any topic off the top of your head that you see coming across the front pages of the paper, and you realize that we have, in this state, we have a really cool definition of civics education. Mm-hmm. And that definition basically says that civics education is the cultivation of informed political participation by informed citizens, right? With competence, with an understanding of what it means to fully participate, to be an informed voter, for example, to serve on a jury, to go to a zoning meeting and know how it is that politics really happens, because a lot of it's very local. To know how elections work and to understand what a county clerk does for validating ballots, and how you can get involved in local political campaigns, or just care about your neighborhood and provide service to one another. And so part of our challenge then is saying to parents out there that there are some pressures right now to kind of limit the kinds of skills we need to develop. There's this pressure to not have these conversations. And what we need are other folks willing to engage in a dialogue and say, you know what, actually, we need to support schools in having this and doing this kind of work. We need to have schools that provide this opportunity to practice and think about and learn from one another in the classroom setting. COVID, for example, really taught us that school matters. Yeah. Community matters. Kids coming together and sitting around and talking to one another really matters. You learn a lot when you shut off instead of having all these algorithms on your phone that will basically spoon feed you only the information you want to hear. Yeah. And if you want to, move into a gated community or move into a very segregated neighborhood, church, for example, community of faith, for example, there are all kinds of ways that you can limit the kinds of voices that you hear in your life. But public education is one of those places where you don't limit, where you actually have an opportunity to sit around this kind of metaphorical Thanksgiving dinner table with classmates and have a conversation. Yeah. And learn from one another. And a lot of kids, we hope, will go on to college, and college is also a wonderful opportunity where you get to learn from people from all over the country or all over the world. There are lots of different perspectives on issues. But for those kids who don't, public education is kind of the last chance that we have where students can hang out with people who are very different from themselves and have these kind of good, safe, robust conversations. And so we need parents to advocate for it and support that. We need parents to show up at school board meetings and say, I think this is really important. We need parents to show up to parent-teacher conferences and talk to school administrators and say, you know what, I love what's going on in my child's social studies class or my child's language arts class. I think it's really important. They're learning some really important skills. I don't always agree with what they're now thinking, or we talk about that, or I don't necessarily like every single topic that is discussed in the classroom, but I feel like it's important. It's important for kids to engage in this. And so that's one of the ways that parents can really help support and send that message that we value this kind of conversation. There was a recent study a couple years ago put out by the Sutherland Institute, which is a think tank here in Utah, and it showed that there was overwhelming support for both transparency in education and teaching kind of hard history, which basically means just teach what history is. History is an argument about the past based on evidence, and there's a lot of wonderful things that have happened throughout history, and there are also a lot of horrible things that happen throughout history. I mean, just today is history in the making, and history isn't any different today than it was 100 years ago in terms of the issues that we're facing and the complexities that we face. And so students need to be able to understand that. And parents and the people in that survey really supported that concept. And they also supported the concept that the primary function of education is to help students think for themselves. Mm-hmm. And that's a really critical skill.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. A lot of students, like myself, recognize great educators with a passion for giving the rising generation the tools that we need to enter adulthood and true citizenship. In high school, I had a great history teacher that I had for APUSH and AP Gov. And what made her great is that she had us thinking about like topics that could be uncomfortable. She let us be uncomfortable and try to figure out what we thought. As young people emerge into adults, how can we continue to build on the foundation that social studies educators have provided for us?
Well, I think one thing would be to, when I was a kid, we would get the little food pyramid that would tell us to have a balanced diet. If you're going to have a bowl of, like Fruity Pebbles, then make sure you also get an apple in your body, mm-hmm. and get this kind of balanced nutrition. And I think that the same analogy could be used for information sources. So, for example, you want to stay informed. You want to be informed. Well, don't just limit yourself to one source of information. Push yourself to have a balanced diet and listen to sources of information that you may or may not initially agree with. And you may not like listening to some of the perspectives that other people have, but mm-hmm. we owe it to ourselves, to our brains, and to this country to be well informed, and that means really be thoughtful about and engage in a range and a good balanced diet of information sources, number one. Number two, social studies is not an abstraction, it's in reality. So it means getting involved in your local community, and it might just mean volunteering at the local animal shelter. It might mean helping out at a food bank. It might also mean going to a public meeting from time to time and hear what the issues of the day really are in the neighborhood or in your community. It might mean helping a candidate that you really like run for, dog catcher for the city or state senator or whatever. But I do think, and then there are also real opportunities for your own leadership, to run for student body or to serve in some capacity. I think that's a way that people can really understand that social studies concepts and civics really are alive and well and matter. Reach out to communities that you don't know a lot about. Attend other cultural fairs, try different food, travel the world, but don't just be a tourist. Also learn from that travel about what the what those communities are like. So
yeah,
there's just a lot you can do.
Yeah. I think that's a really beautiful answer. How can people advocate for well-rounded social studies and its ongoing importance in shaping informed citizens?
Well, I think that for one, you can demand that you have engaging instruction. So we try to do that from our end in terms of supporting and working with teachers to make sure that what they're doing in the classroom is inspiring and interesting. And we want to make sure that that's the service we provide to students like you. So there's definitely that piece. I mean, the nice thing about in Utah is that we have specific courses that are required in social studies education. Not every state does that, but we require world history and we require world geography and we require U.S. history and Utah studies, so that the concept is that you can learn about your local community, but you can also learn about the world and you can learn about the U.S. and understand it from both a geographic perspective and economic perspective and so on. So in terms of kind of encouraging that well-rounded education, it begins with those courses, but then it also needs to focus in on the skills we want to develop. If you're going to be an informed participant in political life, you have to know how to source information. There's so much misinformation out there now that we need to make sure that students really understand how to read and write and sift through all of that artificial intelligence and misinformation that's out there. So we've got to develop that. We've also got to really think about the ways we can provide opportunities to do something like simulations of democratic experiences. So we have programs like We the People and mock trials, and those really kind of mimic the public hearings that we have and the way that the rule of law is centered in the Constitution. And so those experiences are also really valuable and can be really powerful for students. So, just engaging and real life as much as possible and as relevant as possible, student-centered as much as possible. Those are the kinds of ways we want to make sure that social studies continues to be really relevant and interesting and fun. It ought to be fun. I mean, social studies is fascinating. You're learning all about who we are as humans. So
yeah. Okay. I have one last question for you. What does an ideal world look like to you?
Well, I think that's a great question, because I think if we can't imagine a better future, we can't get there. And we've lately had so much emphasis on all the kinds of ways that things aren't working out, that I do think it's important for us to think about the ways that things are working out. So, Maslow's hierarchy would say that we'd start with making sure that everybody had, didn't have to worry about where their next meal was going to come from. I think that food, water, housing, safety, feeling safe, feeling secure, those are things that many of us take for granted, but all over the planet, you've got people who do not know where their next meal is going to come from, who are not safe, who have to worry about violence, who have to worry about a bomb falling on them, or just, domestic terror in their own lives. So ideally, we would get to a place in this world where we could erase those kinds of levels of insecurity for people. And then we could start focusing, once that was taken care of, on the really fulfilling aspects of life, which is, again, that question of how do we live together? How do we dance together? How do we have more music in our lives? How do we have more art in our lives? How do we have opportunities for neighbors to meet neighbors, and to not have so much conflict with one another, when there's really so much as humans that we need to celebrate about what a beautiful, beautiful world we live in.
I think that's absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for meeting with me today. That's everything I have.
Well, good luck to you. I'm so excited about your future. I think it's going to be bright, and obviously you care about making this world a better place. Yeah. So good luck.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, nice to meet you. All right, take care.
Yep, have a good one. Thank you so much for listening. I'd really appreciate it if you'd like and subscribe to my YouTube channel, and even share it even. My Instagram handle is @uinvoting, all lowercased. Now, get out there and let your voice be known.